Have you ever seen someone walking sideways? It was the year I had just entered university, and my parents took me on a vacation to the small town where my grandparents lived. My cousin was there too. He was 2 years older than me, and we had always been close since childhood. Even though we hadn't seen each other for several years, we quickly got along and shared the room in the night. My cousin's father, my Uncle James, was the police officer in town, and he was always busy with work. That's why my cousin often stayed at our grandmother's house. During my visit, there was chatter about several recent missing persons cases, which kept my uncle preoccupied, so I hardly had the chance to see him. This night, I was just about to sleep when my cousin shook me awake abruptly, clutching a wad of cash in his hand. With a smug expression, he shook it in front of me and said, "Want to hang out, buddy? Let's go get a couple of drinks." At that time, I had just come of age. My parents were super strict with me, though I did have drinks before. I had yet to truly experience the nightlife. Excitedly, I agreed, and the two of us tiptoed out of the bedroom, ensuring that both our parents and grandparents were asleep before quietly slipping out the door. The winter night was harsh, bitterly cold. Each breath felt like inhaling razor blades. I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination, but I sensed an indescribable and unsettling odor mingling with the icy air, a strange mix of sweetness and foulness. Afraid of running into his patrolling father, my cousin deliberately led me down a side street, through a secluded alley cloaked in tree shadows, until suddenly, we were surrounded by a cacophony of voices as we arrived at the entrance to a nightclub. We swiftly joined the queue and made our way inside. My cousin exchanged familiar greetings with the patrons and escorted me to the bar to order drinks. After a couple of rounds, I began to feel a bit lightheaded. With a grin, my cousin suggested we step outside for a smoke before returning. Clearly a regular, he opted to lead us through a discreet side door, rather than endure another wait in line at the main exit. When we stepped outside, it was a quiet alley right in front of us. As my cousin lit up my cigarette, in the faint glow of the flame, I suddenly noticed what appeared to be two figures standing deep within the alley. But there was no light there at all. On such a cold night, who would be standing there in the dead of night? I rubbed my eyes and squinted, trying to see deeper into the alley. As my vision adjusted to the darkness, the scene became clearer. There were two women with long hair, both standing sideways, not facing each other but looking in the same direction. Just then, from within that darkness, I heard someone calling out to me.
"Come over here."
It was a woman's voice, but it sounded peculiar, as if she had something in her mouth while speaking, sounding muffled and unclear. Shortly after, I heard another woman's voice calling me over as well. After their calls, they giggled softly before engaging in a hushed conversation, as if they were discussing something. I started to feel scared. I turned to my cousin and asked, "Did you see that?" But my cousin seemed confused, asking me in return what I had seen. With a surge of courage from an unknown source, I found myself taking a few steps towards the depths of the alley. It felt as if I were bewitched, feeling compelled to see who those two women were. Laughter echoed intermittently from the depths of the alley, accompanied by the two women waving at me, as if encouraging me to come closer. Step by step, I approached them. At that moment, I faintly heard my cousin calling my name from behind. It was as if his voice snapped me out of a trance, and the fear finally overcame my curiosity, causing me to halt my steps. Seeing me frozen in place, the two women continued to wave and beckon to me. I stood motionless as they seemed to exchange a silent communication, then started to walk towards me, one step at a time, still with their sides to me. Their ankles seemed boneless, unnervingly flexible, contorting with each step, yet they didn't appear oblivious to feel anything, steadily walking toward me. At that moment, fear overwhelmed me. I turned around, grabbing my cousin's arm, and started to run. We dashed all the way back to the secluded alley we came from. In a daze, I could almost see my grandmother's house ahead. Suddenly, a cold blast of wind struck me, carrying with it a foul stench that nearly suffocated me. Then, I heard a sound of rustling leaves behind me. I turned around and find the two women trailing behind us, still sidestepping, clad in ragged sweaters and mismatched high heels. They were running sideways towards me at an incredible speed. I was almost frantic. I looked around and found my cousin had disappeared. I tried to run, but no matter which way I fled, the alley seemed endless. Even though I could see the main road ahead, I couldn't seem to get there. After what felt like an eternity, I suddenly heard my cousin calling my name from behind, and I felt a tug on my shoulder. It was then that I snapped out of it, realizing I had somehow squeezed into a narrow crevice. I found myself trapped between the narrow space of two buildings, my clothes torn at the shoulders from the tight squeeze. Suddenly, from deep within the crevice, I heard the click-clack of high heels, and in no time, the two women were swiftly approaching, one behind the other, sidestepping. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital. According to my cousin, as soon as I stepped out the club that day, I began acting strangely. I started screaming and running erratically. He kept calling my name as I dashed ahead, completely deaf to his calls. I ended up in that alley, wedged in the gap between buildings, in a state of delirium. Subsequently, my uncle informed us that the police had discovered the bodies of the two women lodged in the crevice of that alley, the very same individuals who had recently disappeared. They had been murdered and left there, still positioned sideways even in death. Be careful. Sometimes on some roads, you might not be the only one walking. For a while, I argued with my parents a lot, and the reason was simple. I was almost on my phone 24/7. They kept nagging me about it, but I just couldn't break away from it. I spent my days glued to my phone, endlessly scrolling through TikTok and Instagram. I did it during class, after class, while eating, and before sleeping. I was even on my phone when I was walking. Nevertheless, I ignored my parents' advice and justified it as the new lifestyle of young people. One afternoon after school, I headed outside with my phone in hand like usual, scrolling through videos as I walked. Initially, I still kept an eye on people around me, but as I distanced myself from the school gates, the crowds gradually thinned. I started to get engrossed entirely in my phone and fixed my eyes on the screen. Only when approaching intersections or crossing streets did I briefly glance up to assess my surroundings before quickly returning my focus to the screen, fearing I might miss out on any captivating video content. As I walked along, a ball suddenly rolled to my feet, a very small one, like a child's toy. Without much thought, I gave it a nudge. The ball zigzagged its way into the middle of the road. Then, a child darted out from behind me, running towards it. I looked up and found the child had made it to the road's center, cradling the ball while brushing off the dust, casting me an angry look. However, what caught my attention were his peculiar eyes, encircled by large, dark rings. These eyes, with more whites than dark pupils, just like some kind of animals. His lips are moving, but I couldn't make it out what he was saying. However, his grim face and penetrating gaze sent chills down my spine. I turned my face away and prepared to leave. Suddenly, a car raced toward the intersection as it got closer to the child. It showed no signs of slowing down. I was in panic. I shouted and waved, trying to get the child to come back. Yet, the child remained frozen in place, and the speeding car quickly crashed into him. I screamed out as I imagined him lying on the ground, possibly covered in blood. But strangely, the car simply continued on its path, and the child disappeared without a trace, leaving the road spotless. Filled with fear, I hastily grabbed a passerby and asked, Did you see that child?" She looked at me warily, perhaps thinking I was drunk, and quickly shook me off before walking away in a panic. Suddenly, I feel someone's tugging my sleeve. I looked down and saw it was that child. This time, on closer look, I realized his face was as pale as a sheet of paper. He stared at me with eyes almost entirely consumed by the whites. His lips moved as he's trying to say something, yet I couldn't hear a thing, but his eerie appearance still frightened me. In a panic, I quickly shook him off and ran back home. I told my parents about it when I got home, but none of them took it serious. According to them, I must have been exposed to inappropriate content online, which resulted in hallucinations. Later after dinner, when I tried to recall the event, I realized that the memory had blurred. I couldn't even remember the child's face anymore, and I started to believe that I must have experienced a hallucination too. The next day, I had completely put the incident behind me. On the way home from school, I was still glued to my phone. As I walked, I suddenly felt something beneath my foot. I bent down to look, but there was nothing there. I continued walking, but the sensation of stepping on something persisted. I checked again, but still nothing. After a few more steps, almost instinctively, I turned back and was startled to find a child standing right behind me. He held a ball in his arms, glaring at me with resentment. I was a bit frightened. Looking around, I noticed something strange. Everyone on the street moved at an unusually slow pace, regardless of whether there was anyone in front of them or not. Moreover, they all had blank expressions, lifeless eyes, staring straight ahead, as if they were mere automatons. And there were many children on the street, playing together without any adults nearby to oversee them. One of them even ran into the middle of the road. At that moment, another ball rolled to my feet, and I kicked it away without thinking, just like the last time. The ball continued rolling and ended up in the middle of the road once more, followed closely by a child chasing after it. A sense of déjà vu washed over me, and I looked up toward the intersection where, sure enough, a car was approaching rapidly. I felt as if I had traveled back in time, witnessing a recurring nightmare. As the car approached the child, it screeched to a halt with a piercing sound. Then came a deafening crash, and the child was sent flying through the air, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. His body seemed like a rag doll tossed into the sky before crashing heavily onto the ground. At that moment, another object rolled to my feet. I looked down, and it wasn't a ball this time, but the child's head. He grinned at me, blood still trickling from the severed neck. His eyes, as the last time, were mostly consumed by the whites. I was frozen in horror, unable to move or even scream. Then, the child opened his mouth and spoke. This time, I finally heard him. He said,
You see me?
"Since then, I've never played with my phone while walking. It's said that this road is shared by both the living and the dead. If you don't watch where you're going, you might just end up somewhere else, like another world."